Welcome to Drinks and Diplomacy, where we're cheersing to sanctions. Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Drinks and Diplomacy podcast. As always, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Really excited to dive into this conversation here today on sanctions, a very interesting tool that has been increasing in use over the years. I did a little research. It looks like the U.S. has over 12,000 people sanctioned at this point. So why don't we jump right in? Andrea, why don't you introduce yourself and the drink you brought today and tell us why your drink has been, should be, or could be sanctioned.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's so good to be here with you. This is Andrea Castillo. I am Program Officer with World Oregon, and I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but I'm so excited to talk about sanctions, mostly because this is part of the conversation that I am excited to learn about. It's one of the areas that I'm super unfamiliar with. So I'm ready to learn from our speaker today so that we can dive right in. My drink that I brought today, I have a tendency to bring drinks that aren't completely aligned with the theme of the choice. So bear with me. We're going with the many different types, right? There's 3 different types, I think, or multiple different types of sanctions. And we're going to talk about some of those today, but really they're used to modify behavior, right? That's kind of the big picture that I get. And, you can really be very creative and you can attach a lot of kinds of drinks to that. But really what I think about when I think about modifying behavior is tea. And so you might want to think about how different kinds of teas you approach in different kinds of cultures. So I have yerba mate today. And so yerba mate, one of the ways that you drink is there's a specific kind of cup that you use and a specific pompote, a straw. It's customary, depending on where you are coming from, drinking yerba mate to be passing around the cup as you're drinking tea. And so it's super interesting to be able to see how different types of drinks you bring modify the behavior of the group you're in. And so that's why I brought yerba mate today. And I'm super excited to talk about it, engage with it, and to hear what else has been brought by the folks here.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Andrea. As outlined in our intro podcast, yerba mate is one of my favorite drinks as well. So kudos to you for that solid one. For me, I'm not sure that we can call it a Moscow Mule because it's not with Russian vodka because of their invasion of Ukraine, sanctions being placed on Russia. So got some good old-fashioned American vodka in there to make it the Texas Mule or something of that nature. Anyway, the state of New Hampshire, which has its own state-run liquor stores, in solidarity with Ukraine, removed all Russian vodka for a little while from their shelves. So I thought it was an appropriate thing to bring to our conversation about sanctions, how our global economy allows us a unique position as the United States to try and modify the behavior of our adversaries and sometimes our friends as well through the use of sanctions, secondary sanctions, and all the fun stuff we'll get into today with our amazing speaker, Dr. Bruce Jentleson, who is the William Preston Few Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy. I'm not sure how you fit that onto your business card, although maybe we don't even need business cards anymore in this post-COVID world. But Dr. Jentleson, thank you so much for joining us today. And what did you bring for your sanction-related drink?
Thank you for inviting me. So since we are talking about sanctions, and some of the longest running and most complicated sanctions the United States are against Cuba. And I was in Cuba in 2012 when they served mojitos with almost every meal. So I'll confess it's a mock, since we are, at least when we're talking, it's in the afternoon. But mojitos are wonderful. It's got everything in it except for the Cuban rum. But it's still got flavor with the mint and the lime, and it's pretty tasty. So,
well, and that brings up one of the greatest rum debates of all time, I would say, is Bacardi Cuban rum or Puerto Rican rum? Of course, being founded in Cuba, and then at the start of the revolution and the sanctions being imposed, they moved their production to Puerto Rico. So one of the interesting sort of stories of sanctions that we might get into here today a little bit. But Dr. Jentleson, can you just give us a little bit of insight? We hear about sanctions all of the time, but not with too much of a description of what they are. So, what is a sanction in terms of foreign policy?
Sure, and to give your listeners some context, with my professor hat on, I've written on economic sanctions really throughout my academic career. My most recent book, which was published in 2022, is called Sanctions: What Everyone Needs to Know. Now, I will say, so as not to be the arrogant academic, that the subtitle is part of a series that Oxford Press runs. Everything is something, what everyone needs to know. And when I give talks on this, I say it's what everyone needs to know, but not everything everyone needs to know. And also with my policy hat on, having served in various administrations way back in the early 90s, when Bill Clinton was president, Al Gore was vice president, I worked on the China sanctions that were imposed after Tiananmen Square. I was in the Obama administration for the early couple of years, worked on the Iran sanctions. So I've really had the policy as well as the academic perspective on them. And there are many different types, as folks were saying before. They're basically using economic tools for primarily political, strategic, diplomatic objectives. And it's interesting that we call them tools because the United States uses sanctions so much that some people call them the Swiss Army knife of American foreign policy. When in doubt, use sanctions. Most recently, President Biden imposed some sanctions. We can talk about these on some Israeli settlers in the West Bank who've been, conducting violence against Palestinians and the like. So they're very frequently used. I've been told, though, that by calling them the Swiss Army knife, people tell me, Swiss Army knife, everything in the Swiss Army knife has a use. And the problem with sanctions is they don't always work. So the analogy has some limits, but I still use it anyway.
Sure. And I think my preferred analogy is the weapon of first resort rather than last resort. It seems like these are what the powers that be want to use first and foremost as an attempt to try and coerce some of the international actors out there. So, can you talk a little bit about how these sanctions are created, who they are focused on? Are they, for the most part, broad and hit entire countries, or are they individualized and hit individual actors? What do those look like?
Yeah, well, first of all, different countries use sanctions. We've talked already about the United States. For example, China, which for years, decades, criticized sanctions as Western imperialism, capitalism run amok, has actually been using sanctions quite frequently in the last 10 or 15 years against Australia, against Japan, against the Philippines, against Taiwan, against Norway, France, Lithuania, for all different reasons. The UN uses sanctions. It used sanctions very little in its first few decades, but recently it's been using them a lot. South Africa case may be the most familiar. We'll talk about that later. So they're used by a lot of actors. The European Union uses them. And the United States uses them in a number of ways. You can sanction a whole country. You can sanction a sector of the economy, say like the energy sector. I mean, look, OPEC used sanctions against the United States way back in the early 1970s at a time when I can remember, maybe some of your listeners can, that early 70s I had a very cool Mustang that got about 12 miles to the gallon. And when gasoline went up from 29 cents a gallon to over $1, I could no longer afford my Mustangs. So they've been used a lot. They also can be used against individuals. You get individuals that are put on a designated list, Russian oligarchs, drug lords, terrorists, and organizations. So there can be a lot of different levels to them. They can be trade, they can be foreign aid, they can be finance, they can be sports and cultural. A lot of the sanctions against Russia on Ukraine have been keeping them out of Eurovision and FIFA World Cup. And the same thing happened with South Africa in the 80s on rugby and other sorts of things. So lots of different aspects of sanctions. And sometimes, you use them all, and sometimes you decide which ones you think will be the most effective.
And is it mostly like government entities that are imposing sanctions? So is there a specific group that is working towards international sanctions or local? Is it just to, kind of we talk a little bit more about that piece of thing?
Really good question. So the UN Security Council can vote to impose sanctions, which it does. Those are the most global sanctions. And they've been imposed by the Security Council at various times against Iran, North Korea, South Africa, even before South Africa, Rhodesia, which was the white minority government that was before Zimbabwe in Africa. So the UN Security Council can do it through a vote of the Security Council. In the US, they can either done by Congress or a president through his own executive action can do it. And within the executive branch, it's kind of a combination of the Treasury Department, the State Department, maybe some others. But they've also been done at the local level. So in the 1980s, when Nelson Mandela was leading the anti-apartheid movements in South Africa, a number of cities and states in the United States imposed sanctions because at that point the Congress had not. The Reagan administration eventually came around, but wasn't. And so what happens there is, let's just say the city of Berkeley did it, no surprise. And that meant that any company that did business with the city of Berkeley had to divest of its investments in South Africa, or big pension funds like the State Retirement Fund in California and elsewhere would divest of companies. And then that put pressure on private sector companies to take their money out of South Africa or bring their own pressure. So, yeah, there are a lot of different variations on this. Consumer groups did it against, Lowe's and Home Depot on lumber coming from Brazil, from the rainforest. And those consumer groups didn't impose sanctions, but they put enough pressure on companies like Home Depot and Lowe's that they stopped buying that lumber. So lots of different ways of getting at sanctions. The principal ones, of course, are those done by governments, but many different aspects to it.
As we were talking about earlier, just to kind of follow up, we were saying how the analogy of the Swiss Army knife might not be so on par because not all the times do they work. Are there any kind of penalties, or who imposes the penalties for breaching sanctions, and what do those kind of look like?
There are a lot of penalties. Right now, with the Russia-Ukraine sanctions, there are a lot of companies that are sanctions busting. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in England for a conference that was convened by the British Foreign Office that's working on strengthening their implementation and enforcement. And they had a bunch of people in Britain and some of us who know about sanctions from the US over. So it's a little bit of a cat and mouse, more than a little bit of a cat and mouse game. Or North Korea, for example, even though we don't consider them particularly sophisticated technologically, they were busting some of these financial sanctions with over $2 billion in cryptocurrency, right? So there are a lot of different ways on it. The other thing that happens sometimes is there are a lot of law firms in Washington that help companies try not to violate sanctions inadvertently. So, for example, in Syria, there are a lot of sanctions against the Bashar Assad regime for human rights and other reasons. But at the same time, there are a lot of humanitarian and human rights NGOs, non-government organizations working, say, in northern Syria to try to help people. But when the Trump administration imposed, across the board sanctions, it meant that companies that did shipping and insurance were afraid that even though they were trying to get to the humanitarian groups, if it inadvertently got to the Syrian government, they could be prosecuted, right? And so, that was called de-risking. And so some of the humanitarian groups suffered because companies were afraid of being fined for trying to do the right thing and maybe making a mistake. And the Biden administration loosened some of those sanctions so that a little bit more could flow to human rights groups. But yeah, it's very complicated, and when people get caught, a colleague of mine calls it going whale fishing rather than, trout fishing. If you get a big company and you give them a big fine, you send a message out there, right? And others get the message, say, well, maybe we should be careful and not try to bust the sanctions because even though we could have a profit by doing that, if we get caught, we got a big penalty.
That sort of brings us to the conversation about secondary sanctions. We hear, again, a lot about those with not a lot of explanation as to what they are and how they differ from, I guess you would call them primary sanctions. But can you dive into a little bit about what that looks like and how they differ?
Your secondary sanctions usually happen when the US is imposing sanctions and other countries are not, including allies. And so there we say, if your companies are using American-made parts or technologies patented in the United States or the dollar, then they cannot do business with us. For example, in the Obama administration, all of the allies worked together on sanctions against Iran to get Iran to agree to the nuclear non-proliferation agreement, which, by the way, Russia and China work with us on that too. When the Trump administration pulled out of that agreement, which by most intelligence sources was working reasonably well, a lot of Europeans didn't want to do that. And sometimes then they have a choice. Well, we still want to trade with Iran, not just for the money, but we think it's the right thing to do to build relations. But if we can't use the American dollar and all our banks get sanctioned, that's a much bigger economic penalty than the gain from Iran. So they would find different ways of doing barter and getting around it legally. And so those are the secondary sanctions where you have a country that doesn't want to cooperate. And the US says, okay, well, we'll sanction you and your relations with us to try to get you to cooperate on the sanctions against that third party.
So sanctions are not just reserved then for foes or organizations or people that we want to, or not want to, but do compete with in various fields. It sometimes does fall onto our allies when they aren't doing necessarily what we want.
Yeah, that's happened a lot with these pipelines. There was the beginning of Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was this pipeline called Nord Stream 2, which was bringing natural gas from Russia under the North Sea into Germany. And Germany and other European companies had, increased their, too much, but it increased their use of Russian natural gas, partly to say, hey, the Middle East is an unstable place. We want to diversify our portfolio, and it was cheaper. Way back when, I'm going to go back now when I was a PhD student in the late 70s, early 80s, and wrote my dissertation in my first book on two pipeline cases from the Cold War. One was an oil pipeline in the 60s called the Friendship Oil Pipeline, and the US was against it. Some of Europe wanted it. We did secondary sanctions. The other was in the early 80s, Siberian natural gas pipeline, same thing, where even Margaret Thatcher, who supported Ronald Reagan on most things, opposed the United States on that pipeline. So I told people when Nord Stream came along, I had my personal trilogy of pipelines, of energy pipelines with the Soviet Union and Russia. But each one has involved different degrees of cooperation of allies, but lots of use of secondary sanctions in each case.
And we've talked a little bit about the types of sanctions that can be imposed, right? Like we've heard about diplomatic sanctions, economic sanctions, military, and environmental. And then there's also one that I was really interested in, came across about sports sanctions. Like you wouldn't really think about how much these types of restrictions can impact you, not only from like your everyday trade, but also with a theme like sports. Can you talk a little bit about that piece?
Yeah, so let's use the South Africa case as an example because that's probably one of the most successful cases of economic sanctions. The way that they played a role in the fall of apartheid, the freeing of Nelson Mandela, the transition to black majority democracy. Having said that, some of the sanctions against South Africa started in the early 60s. And if we had asked the question in the early 80s, 20 years later, are they successful? We would have said no. But by the late 80s, early 90s, they had. And one of the elements of that, exactly what you're asking, Andrea, were sports sanctions. Big sports in South Africa are cricket and rugby and to a certain extent football, soccer. And South Africa was banned from a lot of global tournaments and championships. And for the average, white Afrikaner, the psychological effect of that, right? Pride in your country, that really means we're isolated. Sometimes we can get around the economic sanctions through various ways, that they really were a factor eventually in the sanctions impact combined with the economic one. So sports and culture are really big. Against Russia, same kind of thing happened with some of the bans I was talking about before. While a minority democracy, South Africa was a democracy, so those white Afrikaners, average people, had some say in their government. And Russia, that's not happening. But there is a sense of Russians of feeling, not only economically isolated, in the last Olympics, the Russian athletes were allowed to compete, but not under the Russian flag. Some people thought they shouldn't be allowed to compete anyway, but that was sort of unfair to the individuals who trained for so many years. And so they're a big part of this package against Russia too. And if in the end, sanctions, along with the other efforts being done to make Ukraine free, prevail and Russia withdraws, and if you'll probably talk to Russians, you'll probably hear about those sports and cultural sanctions. So in the same way, South African ones didn't connect or pay off for a while, it's the jury may be a little bit out still on the Russia-Ukraine ones.
So we've talked about different types of sanctions, who gets sanctioned and broadly why. Can you give us any sort of insights or themes or trends that we see in the success or failure rate of sanctions and what tends to make sanctions more or less successful?
So on the success rate, there are different measures. Some studies put it at 30 something percent. I always use the sports analogy. If 30%, 3 out of 10 hits for a baseball player is really good, right? 3 out of 10, I'm from Duke, so we think basketball, 3 out of 10 at the free throw line is not very good, right? So you got to figure out what your percentage is, but it's not great, right, for policy. So you have a lot of aspects. One is you have sanctions that have huge economic impact, but don't achieve their political objectives. Think Cuba, right? Enormous economic impact, but have not achieved their political objectives. In some cases, the Europeans have imposed some sanctions against Cuba, but not as many, more flexible. And a few years ago, Spain, which was the original colonial power of Cuba till the 1898, through the Catholic Church, big in Spain and big in Cuba still, negotiated the release. I think the number was 62 political prisoners in exchange for lifting some sanctions. So you can ask yourself as an American, which is a better policy, right? If you really care about freedom and human rights, is it compromising and getting some people free, or saying we're not going to do anything?
Well,
So
and also just to jump in there, one of the theories out there is that the sanctions, the tough sanctions against Cuba, give the government of Cuba cover for the poor economic performance of their country. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that backfiring or scapegoating that can happen?
yeah, somewhat. I think it was truer of different generations. Right now, the younger generations are like, they don't really remember that, with the US. When you're talking about Bacardi before, it's great because when the Castro Revolution happened in 1959, given how corrupt and dictatorial the previous government Batista was, Bacardi and other businesses supported the revolution. They thought it was going to make Cuba better. And a few years later, when Castro became more repressive, that's when they went to, Puerto Rico and elsewhere. So I don't think, I mean, I think they like to say that. I'm not sure that really helps them with the 25-year-old of today. The other situations you have is where the country, like the United States and other countries that are much more economically powerful, like with Russia today. But what you find, you got to think about sanctions like as offense, defense, right? I mean, think about military power, right? We were much more powerful than Iraq or Afghanistan, but that didn't achieve victory, right? And so in sanctions, the target of the sanctions has strategies. They can find alternative trade partners. China, some, India, which is otherwise an American ally, has been buying lots and lots of Russian oil. Some of it refines and re-exports to the rest of the world. United Arab Emirates, which we work together a lot, has not joined the sanctions. Israel had not joined the sanctions before this war, right? So you find alternative trade partners where even if it's not as good a deal or more expensive, you're still reducing the effect. You also take domestic measures. Putin took some measures on preventing money from leaving the country and took some measures to repress protests and stuff. And then you sanctions bust. You find a whole bunch of ways to sanctions bust. So if we think about this offense and defense, which we don't usually do in sanctions, we say, oh, hey, we got all this economic power. Why can't we achieve it? So you got all those factors. And then for success that you were asking about, Tim, there are a couple factors that tend to be key. So one is making them as multilateral as possible. Again, UN sanctions don't always work. And the US sanctions against Russia have actually been not perfectly multilateral, but more multilateral than any sanctions other than UN ones. That helps. Second is what I sort of call proportionality, that sanctions are a tool, but you don't get any country to say uncle. And when they're used for, say, regime change, which is what we've been doing in Cuba, and it's certainly what we've been doing in Iran. I mean, think about that. It's disproportionate to economic pain to bring about regime change. So you have to have a proportionality between the objective. I use Iran again as an example. When the Obama administration used sanctions to trying to get not a new government in Iran, but policy change on nuclear weapons development, those two were proportional. Certain amount of economic pain, policy change. When the Trump administration did its sanctions, it ratcheted up the economic sanctions, more economic pain, but its objective was regime change. Not going to happen. So you have to have that relationship. And then at the end of the day, you have to have a degree of reciprocity. If I cooperate with you, I sign the agreement, what do I get in return? And whether that's lifting sanctions or additional benefits. So there needs to be a carrot that comes with the stick. So there are a couple of others, but those are the three most important factors. And when you look across at which sanctions work and which don't, kind of tends to hold as a pretty good guide for success.
Thank you so much for kind of giving us some of that broad overviews as we're thinking about the many intricacies that come with sanctions. And I was just thinking about how appropriate it is that your book is titled What Everyone Needs to Know, and it's really kind of staying away from everything about sanctions. And I think that's really aligned with the purpose of this podcast. And I am really intrigued to know, what, just kind of taking a step back as well, what brought you to be interested in sanctions and to really make a career of this? Mostly want to kind of see and get an insight into that side of what made you choose it as your undergraduate degree or your degree for your PhD. Like, I would love to get some insight into that.
Yeah, I was a college student, late 60s, early 70s, during the Vietnam War. And I have to say, I grew up in a pretty sheltered suburban New York childhood. but learned a lot, as we're going through the civil rights movement home in Vietnam, where I got very interested in international affairs. And then I traveled for a while. I did a graduate degree in London and just decided I wanted to do international and worked in Washington for a while on foreign policy issues. And so I eventually got a PhD at Cornell University and became a professor. But again, I've done 4 or 5 different periods of service, and I worked as a Senate foreign policy aide a couple times and presidential campaigns, foreign policy advisor, as well as in the State Department. I've done other work other than sanctions, for example, a lot in the Middle East, which is obviously pertinent today, and back in the 90s was part of one of the negotiating teams in the peace process. For a number of years, actually, I wasn't doing as much work in terms of my own policy work or writing on sanctions, and then I started to come back to it. I got interested in the late 70s, early 80s because you could see, the economy, was becoming more global, and you could see that as we were looking for instruments, tools, strategies beyond just military after Vietnam, had to think about where this would be helpful and where it wouldn't. It engaged a lot of human rights issues. There's a really bad government. Do you impose sanctions? Well, part of you says, yeah. But in a lot of cases, the sanctions hurt the people and not the government. So are you really consistent with your own values? Anyway, and then I came back to it probably around 1999, no, 2019, 2020. Think it was a good time for me to look at what else had been written on sanctions, take the sum total of the work I'd done. And then, of course, Ukraine happened, and then everybody got more interested in sanctions. So I was working on it. I think I signed the contract on this book in 2020 or 2019. And then, of course, it got more attention because of Ukraine and other cases too, but especially Russia, Ukraine.
I hate using the term fortuitous turn for at least your book to gather some more interest, although not so fortuitous for the people of Ukraine, we'll say. So I've got one last question before we wrap up here a little bit. And we've been talking a little bit about how the use of sanctions has increased over the years. You talked about the ways in which some countries and entities are trying to avoid sanctions. You mentioned North Korea using cryptocurrency. We see digital currencies trying to be created and new systems being created. So, is there a risk of using sanctions too often? What are some of the things that we need to be considering, at least from a US perspective? We're using sanctions so broadly, and again, sort of as that Swiss Army knife or that tool of first resort.
Yeah, it goes back to something one of you said earlier about reaching for sanctions so quickly. And I can say I've been in a lot of policy meetings in Washington where that's exactly what happens, right? It's sort of a binary choice. Should we use military force or sanctions? And part of my argument has been if we make it less knee-jerk, automatic, the memo gets a little longer, the meeting gets more intense. Well, what other options do we have? And then if you come back to sanctions after doing that analysis, that's better than, well, let's just reach for sanctions. When in doubt, reach for sanctions. There was an effort at the beginning of the Biden administration before Ukraine to really think about this. And, they brought in some people on the outside. I was one of them. And I said, what we really need is a net assessment framework, right? And before we do sanctions, it's sort of like environmental reviews before you build new roads or bridges or housing projects, because we know enough along the lines we were talking about, to have some sense of the likely impact of sanctions. How likely is it that the country can go around them? How likely is it that you can hit the government and not the people? And, do a net assessment on the front end. And if that comes out prospectively negative, then say, okay, what else could we do here? Right? Because you can argue, and many people do, look, well, if sanctions don't work, they still send a message. I don't totally agree with that. If you say you're going to, send them sanctions to deter somebody and they don't have much impact, the person says, what's the message here, right? But also that if they're net negative, you've hurt people, you've been contrary to your own values, your own interests, and that's worse than just saying they didn't work, right? And that process is an analytic process in government. We actually do it to a certain extent more before using military force these days. And again, we don't always get it right, but I commend that happening. So that would be one way of starting to say, not just whip out the Swiss Army knife, but think about, whether it really can be helpful in this particular instance. And it doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be the be all and the end all, but at least it won't be net negative.
Oh gosh, I feel like I have absorbed a wealth of information today about sanctions, and I'm so appreciative. We are so appreciative to have had you, Bruce, with us to talk to us a little bit about what types, how to use them, kind of just the intricacies that come with sanctions here and abroad. And so to kind of close us off today, we have a tradition that we love to do at the end of each episode where we will cheers to the episode. So we'll count down from 3 and we will all in our language of choice and cheers to a topic of our choice. And so I will count down from 3 and we will go from there. So 3, 2, 1. Salud.
Cheers.
Gracias.
Gracias, Bruce. It's so amazing to have you. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and we will talk with you on the next episode.
The Drinks and Diplomacy podcast is a joint program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and World Oregon.
Your co-hosts and producers are Andrea Castillo, Program Officer at World Oregon, and Tim Horgan, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire.
The audio editor is Tim Horgan.
Our theme music is We Are One by Scott Holmes Music.
Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment. Until next time.